I never went to yoga to meet people. That wasn't the point. The point was the silence, the kind that comes when you're too tired to think, too stretched to worry, too focused on not falling over to remember why you couldn't sleep the night before. I'd been going to Sarah's evening class for 3 months, and I could count on one hand the number of words I'd spoken to anyone there. That's how I liked it. The studio was small, tucked between a used bookstore and a cafe that always smelled like burnt coffee. 8 mats, maximum, soft lighting, no mirrors. Sarah said they were distracting, that yoga wasn't about watching yourself. It was about feeling yourself, being present in your body. I appreciated that. I'd spent enough years avoiding mirrors. The regulars were mostly women in their 40s and 50s, the kind who chatted quietly before class about their kids' soccer games or their book clubs. There was Marcus, who looked like he bench-pressed small cars for fun but had the gentlest hands when he helped with adjustments. And there was Elena, who always arrived exactly 7 minutes early and laid out her mat with the precision of someone who measured sugar for baking. And then there was him. I noticed him the second week I started coming. Not because he was particularly striking, though he was in that understated way that creeps up on you. Dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, shoulders that suggested he'd carried heavier things than yoga blocks, skin that held on to summer longer than it should have in October. But what caught my attention wasn't how he looked. It was how he moved through the space like he was trying not to disturb the air around him. He always arrived exactly on time, never early, never late. Always wore the same black hoodie over whatever shirt he had on, even when the studio was warm and the rest of us were peeling off layers. He'd roll out his mat in the back corner, as far from everyone else as the small room allowed, and sit in silence until Sarah dimmed the lights and we began. He never spoke. Not during the brief moments when Sarah would ask how everyone was feeling, not when she'd invite questions, not even when she'd suggest modifications for poses. He'd just nod if she looked his way, or offer the smallest smile that seemed more like a reflex than genuine warmth. But he was good, really good. His poses were clean, controlled, like he'd been doing this for years. There was something almost military about his precision, the way he held Warrior Two like he was guarding something invisible, the way he folded forward with the discipline of someone who'd learned that surrender was sometimes the only option. I told myself I wasn't watching him. I was just aware of him, the way you're aware of a storm gathering on the horizon, or the way you notice when someone's energy shifts in a room. He carried something heavy. I could feel it from 3 mats away. It wasn't sadness exactly, though there was that too. It was something deeper, older, something that had settled into his bones and made him move through the world like he was apologizing for taking up space. I recognized it because I carried something similar. Different shape, different weight, but the same careful way of existing. The same preference for corners and silence, and the kind of invisibility that comes from years of learning that being noticed usually meant being hurt. For 6 weeks, we shared that room twice a week, breathing the same air, moving through the same sequences, existing in the same pocket of intentional quiet. We never spoke. We barely looked at each other. But there was something there. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. Like seeing your own shadow cast by someone else's light. The first time we really looked at each other was during a particularly challenging flow in late November. Sarah had been guiding us through a sequence that required moving from side plank into Wild Thing, then back to Downward Dog. My shoulders were burning, my left wrist was complaining, and I was concentrating so hard on not collapsing that I didn't notice I was drifting off my mat. I was transitioning from Wild Thing back to side plank when my hand slipped. Just slightly, but enough to throw off my balance. I felt myself starting to tip forward, my carefully controlled movement dissolving into an inevitable fall toward the hardwood floor. Then there was a hand on my shoulder, steady, warm with calluses that spoke of work done with tools or ropes or something that required grip. He'd moved from his mat in the back corner to mine without me even noticing, and now he was holding me upright with the kind of casual strength that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd caught someone mid-fall. "You're good," he said quietly, his voice lower than I'd expected, rougher around the edges. It was the first time I'd heard him speak, and the sound of it did something strange to my chest. Just breathe. Our eyes met for maybe 3 seconds. His were brown, darker than coffee, with flecks of amber that caught the studio's warm lighting. But it was the expression in them that stopped me, not pity or concern, but understanding. Like he knew exactly what it felt like to be off balance, to be reaching for something solid in a world that kept shifting beneath your feet. Thanks, I managed, settling back into child's pose as he returned to his mat. But I could feel the warmth of his hand on my shoulder for the rest of class, and when I glanced back during Savasana, he was looking at me. Not staring, not studying, just seeing. The weight of his attention was oddly comforting, like being wrapped in a blanket you didn't know you needed. After that, something shifted. Not dramatically, neither of us was the type for dramatic shifts, but there were moments, small ones. The way he'd nod when our eyes met during sun salutations, the way he'd sometimes position his mat a little closer to mine, still in the back, still maintaining that careful distance but not quite as isolated, the way he'd linger for just a few seconds after class ended, packing up his mat slowly while I did the same. Sarah noticed. She was one of those instructors who seemed to see everything without appearing to watch anyone. One evening in early December, as I was rolling up my mat, she appeared beside me with that knowing smile teachers get when they think they've figured something out. "You two have good energy together," she said quietly, nodding toward where he was sitting on his mat, methodically folding his hoodie. Sometimes the quietest connections are the strongest ones. I felt heat creep up my neck. "I don't know what you mean." She was still smiling. "You both have that same quality, like you're carrying something important and you're being very careful not to drop it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. But as I walked home that night, I found myself thinking about what she'd said, about connections and energy and the things we carry carefully, about the way his hand had felt on my shoulder, solid and sure in a way that made me realize how long it had been since anyone had touched me with that kind of certainty. The next week, he arrived 5 minutes early for the first time since I'd been going. I was already there, sitting on my mat in what had become my usual spot, third row, left side, close enough to hear Sarah's instructions clearly, but far enough back to avoid being called on for demonstrations. He hesitated in the doorway and I saw him scan the room, his gaze stopping when it reached me. He laid out his mat 2 spaces over from mine, still in the back, still maintaining distance, but close enough that I could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing during the opening meditation. Close enough that when Sarah guided us into twisting poses, I caught the faint scent of his soap, something clean and uncomplicated, like cedar or sage. During Warrior 2, I found myself glancing over at him. His form was perfect as always, but there was something different in his face. Less of that careful blankness he usually wore, more of something I couldn't quite name. Focus, maybe, or intention. When he caught me looking, he didn't glance away immediately like he usually did. For a moment, we held each other's gaze across the small space between our mats, and I felt that same recognition from before, stronger now, like a radio signal getting clearer. It was during Savasana that it happened. The lights were dimmed to almost nothing, Sarah's voice guiding us through a body scan relaxation, and I was lying there trying to let go of the tension I carried in my shoulders when I became aware of someone watching me. Not in an uncomfortable way, more like being seen by someone who understood the architecture of your particular kind of quiet. I opened my eyes slightly, enough to see without appearing awake, and found him looking at me from his mat. His eyes were soft in the dim light, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen before. There was something in his expression that made my breath catch, not desire exactly, though there was heat there, but something deeper. Recognition. Like he was seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was visible. We lay there like that for the rest of Savasana, not quite looking at each other, not quite looking away. It should have been awkward lying in the dark with this near stranger whose name I didn't even know, sharing something wordless and heavy. But it wasn't. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, like we'd been having this conversation in silence for years. When Sarah brought us back to sitting, when the lights came up and the spell broke, I expected him to look away, to retreat back into that careful distance he maintained. Instead, he sat up slowly, ran a hand through his hair, and gave me a small nod, like we'd agreed to something without using words. I packed up quickly that night, more unsettled than I wanted to admit. There was something building between us, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. I'd come to yoga to find peace, to learn how to exist in my own body without the constant noise of anxiety and exhaustion. I hadn't come looking for connection, and I especially hadn't come looking for the kind of connection that felt like it might require me to be more than I was comfortable being. But as I walked home through the December cold, I found myself thinking about the way he'd looked at me during Savasana, like I was worth seeing. Like the careful way I moved through the world wasn't something to fix or overcome, but something to understand. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at me like that. The weather turned properly cold the week before Christmas, Chicago winter cold, the kind that makes you question every life choice that led you to living in a city where the air hurts your face. I started wearing gloves to walk to the studio, and my breath clouded in the air as I hurried down the sidewalk, hunched against the wind. He was there that Tuesday night as always, but something was different. He seemed more tense than usual, the careful control he usually maintained stretched tighter. During the opening meditation, I could hear the slight unevenness in his breathing. During the standing poses, there was a rigidity to his movements that spoke of someone fighting against their own body. It was during a particularly deep hip opener that I saw it, the smallest crack in his composure. Sarah had guided us into pigeon pose, and I was settling into the stretch, focusing on breathing through the intensity, when I heard a sharp intake of breath from his direction. Not loud, barely audible. But in the quiet of the studio, it might as well have been a shout. I glanced over and saw him in the pose, his face turned away, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were pressed flat against the floor like he was trying to anchor himself. Hip openers were notorious for bringing up emotions. Sarah had warned us about that in my first class, how sometimes stretching the places where we store trauma can release more than just physical tension. For a moment, I thought about staying in my own pose, maintaining the distance we'd both been careful to preserve. But something in the set of his shoulders, in the way he was breathing too carefully, made me shift slightly on my mat just enough to catch his attention. When he looked at me, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been just the intensity of the stretch. I held his gaze for a moment, then did something I'd never done in all my months of practice. I smiled, not a big smile, not anything that would draw attention from the others, just a small, quiet expression of understanding maybe, solidarity. He blinked and some of the tension in his face softened. He didn't smile back, but something in his eyes shifted like he was allowing himself to be seen in that moment of vulnerability. We stayed there for the rest of the pose, not looking away, sharing something wordless and necessary. After class, I lingered longer than usual, taking my time rolling up my mat, putting on my coat. Part of me hoped he might say something, might acknowledge what had passed between us during pigeon pose. But he packed up efficiently as always, pulled on that black hoodie, and headed for the door with a quiet good night to Sarah. I was disappointed, and that disappointment surprised me. When had I started hoping for more from this careful stranger? When had his presence become something I looked forward to rather than simply noticed? The answer came to me as I walked home through the empty streets. I'd started hoping the first time he'd touched me, when he'd steadied me during that difficult transition. Or maybe it was during that first real eye contact in Savasana when I'd felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and necessary. Or maybe it had been building from the very beginning, from the first time I'd noticed the weight he carried and recognized it as something similar to my own. Thursday night's class was different, smaller than usual. The pre-holiday schedule had people traveling, spending time with family, doing all the things that regular humans did during the season. There were only 5 of us there: Elena, Marcus, Sarah, him, and me. The intimacy of the smaller group made everything feel more concentrated, more intentional. Sarah seemed to sense it too. She dimmed the lights more than usual, spoke more softly, guided us through a slower, more meditative practice. It felt less like a class and more like a shared ritual, 5 people breathing together in the warm darkness of the studio. During the final relaxation, with the lights dimmed to almost nothing and Sarah's voice barely above a whisper, I felt that familiar awareness of being watched. But this time, when I opened my eyes slightly, I found that he wasn't just looking at me, he was studying me, taking in my face like he was trying to memorize it, or like he was seeing something there that he needed to understand. There was an intensity to his attention that made my pulse quicken, not uncomfortable, but charged with something I couldn't name. Want, maybe, but deeper than that, like he was reaching for something in me that I wasn't sure I was ready to offer. When class ended and the lights came back up, the spell didn't break quite as completely as it usually did. Elena and Marcus chatted quietly as they packed up, but the three of us, Sarah, him, and me, moved in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Sarah seemed to sense something in the air because she took her time closing up, giving us space to linger without making it obvious. I was pulling on my coat when I heard his voice, low and directed at me. Cold night. I turned to find him standing a few feet away, his mat bag slung over his shoulder, that black hoodie zipped up to his throat. It was such a simple observation, barely even a conversation starter, but coming from him it felt significant. "Yeah," I said, then felt stupid for such an inadequate response. Winter in Chicago, always a surprise even when you're expecting it. He almost smiled at that. "You been here long? In Chicago, I mean." 5 years? You? Longer." He paused like he was deciding whether to say more. Sometimes feels like forever. There was something in the way he said it that made me think he wasn't just talking about geography. Before I could figure out how to respond, Sarah appeared from the back room, keys in hand. "You two heading out?" she asked. But there was something knowing in her tone, like she'd been waiting for us to finally have this conversation. "Yeah," he said, then looked at me. "Which way do you walk?" "North." "Up Lincoln." "Me too. Part of the way, anyway." And just like that, we were walking out together into the cold December night. It wasn't planned, wasn't discussed beyond those few words, but it felt inevitable in a way that made my chest tight with something between anticipation and anxiety. The temperature had dropped while we were in class, and the wind off the lake cut through my coat like it was made of paper. I hunched my shoulders against it, wishing I'd worn a scarf, and tried to think of something to say that wouldn't sound forced or awkward. "Thanks," I said finally, "for helping me that time, when I lost my balance." He glanced at me as we walked. "No problem, we all need steadying sometimes." There was something in the way he said it that made me think he was talking about more than just yoga poses. We walked in silence for a block, our footsteps echoing off the empty sidewalk, our breath clouding in the frigid air. "I'm David, by the way," I said, realizing we'd been sharing space for months without ever exchanging names. "Ryan." He said it simply, like he was testing how it sounded between us. "Ryan." I repeated it, liked the way it felt in my mouth. "How long have you been doing yoga?" "Few years. Started after—" He trailed off and I saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Started when I needed something to help me sleep." I wanted to ask what had happened, what had stolen his sleep and made him seek out the kind of peace that only came from exhausting your body and quieting your mind. But there was something in his posture that suggested the story wasn't one he was ready to tell, at least not to someone he'd just started walking with. "It helps," I said instead. "The sleep thing. Sarah's good at that, making everything slow down enough that your brain finally gets the memo." "Yeah." He was quiet for another block, then, "What about you? What brought you to yoga?" I considered how to answer that. The truth was complicated. Burnout from a job that demanded everything and gave nothing back, a relationship that had ended badly and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about myself, a general sense that I'd been living my life on autopilot for so long that I'd forgotten how to actually feel anything. But I needed to learn how to breathe again seemed too honest for a first real conversation. "Work stress," I said, which was true enough. And I figured it was better than therapy. He laughed at that, a short sound that held more understanding than humor. "Cheaper, anyway." We'd reached the corner where Lincoln met Clark, and I realized we were probably close to wherever he lived. The thought of the walk ending, of going back to our separate silences, made me slow my pace slightly. Do you? I started, then stopped, not sure what I was asking. Do you want to keep walking? Do you want to get coffee sometime? Do you want to tell me what put that careful sadness in your eyes and why you move through the world like you're carrying something too heavy to put down? Do I what? He asked. And there was something almost gentle in his voice, like he could hear the question I wasn't asking. Nothing, just, it's nice, having someone to walk with. He nodded, understanding something in that simple statement. Yeah, it is. We stood there for a moment at the intersection, the wind whipping around us, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. There was something building between us, something that felt bigger than casual conversation between yoga classmates. I could feel it in the space between our bodies, in the way he was looking at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd been working on for months. I gestured vaguely north toward my apartment. Yeah, me too. But he didn't move, didn't step away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. For a moment, I thought he was going to check the time or call someone, or do any of the normal things people do with phones. Instead, he held it out to me. In case, he said simply, in case you ever want to walk home with someone. I took the phone, added my number, handed it back. Our fingers brushed during the exchange, and I felt that same jolt of recognition I'd experienced when he'd steadied me in class. Like touching him completed some circuit I hadn't known was broken. David, he said, reading my name from his phone screen like he was committing it to memory. Ryan, I replied, and something in the way we said each other's names felt like a promise. I walked the rest of the way home with a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in months. It was just a phone number, just a few minutes of conversation on a cold night, but it felt like something significant had shifted. Like I'd been holding my breath for months and finally remembered how to exhale. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the way he'd looked at me during Savasana, about the careful way he'd offered his phone, about the sound of my name in his voice. I thought about the weight he carried and the way it seemed to match the weight I carried, like we were both walking around with the same invisible burden. I didn't text him that night or the next day. It felt too soon, too eager, but I found myself checking my phone more often, wondering if he was doing the same thing, wondering if he was thinking about our walk the way I was. Saturday morning came with the kind of snow that transformed Chicago from a gray industrial city into something that looks almost magical. I was drinking coffee by my window, watching the flakes fall fat and heavy onto the fire escapes across the street when my phone buzzed. Ryan, class tonight canceled. Sarah's sick. Thought you might want to know. I stared at the message for a long moment, surprised by the small disappointment that settled in my stomach. I'd been looking forward to Tuesday's class, to seeing him again, to continuing whatever conversation we'd started on that cold walk home. David, thanks for letting me know. Hope she feels better soon. Ryan, yeah, quiet weekend planned? And just like that, we were texting. Nothing profound, nothing that would seem significant to anyone reading over our shoulders, but it felt like we were building something, a bridge maybe, between the careful distance we'd maintained in class and whatever this thing was that seemed to be growing between us. David, pretty quiet. You? Ryan, same. Was going to suggest a walk if you're interested. Different route this time. I stared at the message, feeling that familiar flutter of anxiety and anticipation. It was just a walk. People walk together all the time. It didn't have to mean anything more than two people who'd discovered they enjoyed each other's company. But even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't quite true. There was something about Ryan, about the way he moved through the world and the careful attention he paid to things, that felt like more than casual friendship. There was an intensity there, a depth that suggested this walk would be different from our accidental one after class. David, yeah, I'd like that. Ryan, lakefront, meet by the Oak Street beach sign at 2. David, see you there. I spent the next few hours trying not to overthink it, trying not to read too much into a simple invitation for a walk, But I found myself changing clothes twice, settling finally on jeans and a sweater that was warm but not too warm, casual but not sloppy. I told myself I was just dressing for the weather, but I knew I was lying. The lakefront was beautiful in the snow, all white expanses and the dark line of the water stretching to the horizon. I got there a few minutes early and stood by the sign, watching the lake and trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building since I'd gotten his text. I saw him before he saw me, walking along the path with that same careful precision he brought to everything. He was wearing dark jeans and a navy blue coat I hadn't seen before, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his hair slightly messed from the wind. When he spotted me, he raised one hand in greeting, and I felt that now familiar flutter in my chest. "Hey," he said when he reached me, and his cheeks were pink from the cold. "Hey yourself, this is beautiful." I gestured toward the lake, the snow-covered beach, the city skyline rising behind us. "Yeah, I come here sometimes when I need to think. Something about all that water, it puts things in perspective." We started walking north along the path, our feet crunching in the fresh snow. There were other people out, joggers, dog walkers, families with sleds, but the snow seemed to muffle everything, creating pockets of quiet between us and the rest of the world. "So," I said after we'd walked for a few minutes, "what do you do? When you're not in yoga class, I mean." He was quiet for a moment, and I worried I'd asked something too personal, too soon. But then he said, "Construction, mostly renovations, some new builds. You?" "Marketing, nothing exciting. A lot of emails, a lot of meetings about meetings." "That why you needed yoga? The emails and meetings?" I laughed, but it came out a little hollow. "Among other things. Sometimes you realize you've been living your life on someone else's schedule for so long you forget what you actually want." He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. "I get that. The forgetting part." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow fall on the dark water, listening to the sounds of the city muffled by the weather. There was something peaceful about being with him like this. No agenda, no destination, just two people moving through the world together. "Can I ask you something?" I said eventually. "Sure." "That first time we really looked at each other, during Savasana, what were you thinking?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. We'd stopped walking without discussing it, standing at the edge of the path where the snow met the sand, looking out at the lake. "I was thinking," he said finally, "that you looked like someone who understood things, the hard things, like maybe you'd been carrying something heavy for a while and learned how to do it without complaining about the weight." The honesty of it took my breath away. It was exactly what I'd been feeling about him, that recognition of shared burden, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "And what are you carrying?" I asked, my voice quieter than I'd intended. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tight. Pain, yes, but also a kind of hope, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask that question. "Maybe that's a longer conversation," he said, "for another walk." I nodded, understanding that we were negotiating something here, setting boundaries and making promises at the same time. "I'd like that, another walk." "Good." He turned back toward the path. "Because I was thinking the same thing about you, that you understood things, and I haven't met many people who do." We walked back slowly, taking the long way, neither of us in a hurry to end whatever this was. The snow kept falling, coating everything in clean white, making the world feel hushed and new. When we reached the point where our paths would diverge, Ryan stopped and turned to me. "Thanks," he said, "for this. It's been a while since I've had someone to walk with who didn't expect me to be anything other than what I am." "What are you?" I asked, then immediately felt foolish for such a direct question, but he didn't seem put off by it. Instead, he considered it seriously, like it was something he'd been asking himself for a long time. "I'm someone who's trying to figure out how to be present in his own life again," he said finally. "And you?" "Same," I said, and meant it. Exactly the same. He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face, made him look younger, lighter, like some of that careful weight had lifted, at least temporarily. "See you Tuesday?" he asked. "If Sarah's feeling better. If not, maybe another walk?" I'd like that. I watched him head south toward his apartment, his figure growing smaller in the falling snow until he disappeared around a bend in the path. Then I walked home through the quiet streets, feeling something I hadn't felt in months: anticipation. Not just for Tuesday's class, but for whatever was building between us, slow and careful and real. That night, I got a text from him. "Thanks for today. Sleep well." "You too," I replied. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually did. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm: Tuesday and Thursday yoga classes, occasional walks afterward if the weather wasn't too brutal, text messages that started simple and gradually became longer, more personal, nothing rushed, nothing forced, just two people slowly learning each other's contours. I learned that Ryan had been in the military. He never said which branch, never talked about deployment, but there were hints in the way he moved, the way he scanned rooms when he entered them, the precision with which he folded his yoga mat. I learned that he'd grown up in small-town Michigan, that he'd moved to Chicago for reasons he wasn't ready to discuss, that he read voraciously but mostly mysteries and thrillers, never literary fiction. He learned that I'd been an English major who'd somehow ended up in marketing, that I had a sister in Portland I talked to every Sunday, that I'd been in a relationship for 4 years that had ended when I finally admitted I'd been pretending to be someone I wasn't, and that pretending had been exhausting for everyone involved. We didn't talk about the deeper things, not yet. The reasons we'd both ended up in yoga class, seeking silence and peace and the kind of physical exhaustion that made it easier to sleep. The weight we both carried, the careful way we moved through the world. But I could feel those conversations coming, building like pressure in the air before a storm. It was the second week of January when everything changed. I'd been fighting off a cold all week, the kind of low-grade illness that makes everything feel slightly off but isn't quite bad enough to justify staying home. Thursday night, I almost skipped class, but the thought of missing the opportunity to see Ryan, to share that hour of quiet breathing and careful movement, was enough to get me out of my apartment and into the cold. The class was small again, winter always thinned out the regulars, and I was feeling lightheaded by the time we got to the more challenging poses. During a particularly long hold in Warrior 3, I felt the room start to spin slightly, and I knew I was pushing too hard. I was transitioning from Warrior 3 into Half Moon when it happened. One moment I was balanced on one leg, reaching for the floor, and the next I was falling, my body giving out in a way that had nothing to do with flexibility or strength and everything to do with being slightly sick and slightly stupid. But before I could hit the floor, there were hands on me again. Ryan's hands steadying me, holding me upright with that same calm strength he'd shown months ago. But this time, instead of a quick touch and retreat, he kept his hands on me, one on my back, one on my arm, supporting my weight as I found my footing. "Easy," he said quietly. "Just breathe." I was breathing, but it was shallow, uneven, the kind of breathing that comes with embarrassment and the realization that you've pushed your body past what it could handle. Sarah had noticed, was making her way over, but Ryan waved her off with a small gesture. "I'm okay," I said, but my voice came out weaker than I'd intended. "You're not," he said simply, "and that's okay. But let's get you sitting down." He guided me to the edge of my mat, helped me settle into child's pose, kept one hand on my back as I tried to slow my breathing and stop the room from spinning. His touch was steady, grounding, and I found myself focusing on the warmth of his palm through my shirt instead of the way my head felt like it was full of cotton. "Better?" he asked after a few minutes. I nodded, sitting back on my heels. The dizziness was fading, but I felt stupid, embarrassed, like I'd broken some unspoken rule about taking care of myself. I should probably... I gestured vaguely toward my water bottle, my coat, the door. "Yeah, but not alone." It wasn't a question, wasn't a request. Just a simple statement that he wasn't going to let me walk home by myself when I was clearly not at my best. Something in his tone brooked no argument, and I realized I didn't want to argue anyway. The thought of walking home alone, of being alone with the residual dizziness and embarrassment, felt overwhelming. I packed up quietly while he did the same, aware of Sarah watching us with that knowing expression she got sometimes. As we were leaving, she caught my arm. "Take care of yourself," she said, "and let him help you. Sometimes that's the strongest thing you can do." Outside, the January air was brutal, the kind of cold that steals your breath and makes your eyes water immediately. I pulled my scarf up over my nose and started walking, but Ryan caught my elbow. "This way," he said, turning south instead of north. "My apartment's that way," I protested weakly. "I know, but mine's closer and you shouldn't be alone right now, just until you're feeling steadier." I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that I was fine, that I didn't need taking care of. But the truth was I did feel shaky, and the thought of his apartment, wherever it was, whatever it looked like, felt infinitely preferable to my own empty space. "Okay," I said, and let him guide me through the cold streets. His building was only 4 blocks from the studio, a renovated brownstone that had been divided into apartments. He led me up 2 flights of stairs to a door marked 3B, fishing keys from his pocket with hands that were steadier than mine. "Fair warning," he said as he unlocked the door. "It's not much." But when he turned on the lights, I saw that it was exactly what I would have expected from him. Clean, sparse, everything in its place. A couch that looked comfortable but not expensive, a small kitchen table with exactly 2 chairs, bookshelves lined with paperbacks organized by height rather than author. The walls were mostly bare except for one framed photograph. A landscape, mountains and sky, the kind of view that makes you understand why people leave everything behind to chase horizons. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the couch. "I'll make tea." I settled into the corner of the couch, pulling off my scarf and gloves, letting the warmth of his apartment seep into my bones. From the kitchen, I could hear the quiet sounds of him moving around, water running, the click of the stove lighting, the soft clink of mugs being set on the counter. "Better?" he asked when he came back with 2 steaming mugs, handing me one before settling on the other end of the couch, careful to maintain space between us. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat warm my fingers. "Much, thank you, for this, for walking me home, for everything." "You don't have to thank me." He was looking down into his tea, his hair falling slightly across his forehead. "I know what it's like to feel unsteady. Sometimes you just need someone to make sure you don't fall." There was something in the way he said it that made me think he wasn't just talking about my dizzy spell in class, something that suggested he'd been the one falling, the one needing steadying more recently than he was comfortable admitting. "Ryan," I said, then stopped, not sure what I was asking. He looked up at me then, and in the warm light of his apartment, his eyes looked darker, more serious than they did in the studio. "Yeah? What happened to you?" It was a bold question, maybe too bold, but something about the intimacy of being in his space, of having him take care of me when I hadn't asked for it, made it feel necessary. Like we'd moved past the careful small talk we'd been maintaining for months. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he set his mug down on the coffee table and leaned back into the couch, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "Same thing that happened to you, probably," he said finally. "Life. Choices that seemed right at the time but turned out to be complicated. People who promised things they couldn't deliver." I wanted to push, wanted to ask for details, for the story behind the careful way he moved through the world. But something in his posture told me this was as much as he was willing to share, at least for now. "I get that," I said instead. "The complicated part." "Yeah." He looked at me again, and there was something vulnerable in his expression, like he was deciding whether to trust me with more than he'd already given. "I think you do." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking our tea, existing in the warm quiet of his apartment. There was something peaceful about being with someone who didn't need to fill every moment with conversation, who understood that sometimes silence was its own kind of communication, When I finished my tea, when the dizziness had completely faded and I felt steady on my feet again, I knew it was time to go, but I didn't want to. There was something about this space, about the way Ryan moved through it with such careful precision, that made me want to stay, to learn more about the person behind all that quiet intensity. I should probably head home, I said, though I made no move to get up. Probably, he agreed, but he didn't seem in any hurry to see me leave. Will I see you Tuesday? Yeah, you? Yeah. It was such a simple exchange, but it felt loaded with meaning, like we were making a commitment to more than just showing up to class, like we were agreeing to continue whatever this was that had started with a shared umbrella and was slowly becoming something neither of us had expected. When I finally did leave, when I'd bundled back into my coat and scarf and Ryan had walked me to the door, there was a moment where we stood facing each other in the hallway. The space between us felt charged with possibility, with all the things we hadn't said and weren't quite ready to say. Thank you, I said again. For tonight, for the tea, for... I gestured vaguely, trying to encompass everything he'd given me without having to name it. David, he said, and the way he said my name made me look up at him. You don't have to do everything alone. I know it feels safer that way, but you don't have to. The words hit me harder than they should have, settled somewhere deep in my chest where I'd been carrying the weight of my own careful independence for years. I nodded, not trusting my voice to respond, and headed down the stairs toward the cold night in my own empty apartment. But as I walked home through the quiet streets, I found myself thinking about what he'd said, about not having to do everything alone, about the way it had felt to let him take care of me, even in such a small way, about the comfortable silence of his apartment and the careful way he'd made space for me without making it feel like charity. That night I dreamed about balancing poses, about reaching for something just out of grasp, about steady hands catching me when I fell. Part 2, Tuesday came with a kind of raw February cold that makes you question every life choice that led you to living in a city where winter lasts 6 months. I almost talked myself out of going to class. My apartment was warm, I had leftover takeout in the fridge, and the couch was calling to me with the promise of mindless television and early sleep. But I kept thinking about Ryan, about the careful way he'd taken care of me Thursday night, about the commitment we'd made to see each other again, so I bundled into layers and headed out into the bitter wind, my breath clouding in front of me as I hurried down the sidewalk. I got to the studio 5 minutes early, which was unusual for me. I preferred to arrive exactly on time to slip in as the lights were dimming and avoid the small talk that happened in those moments before class began. But something about the way my week had gone, restless, unsettled, filled with thoughts of tea in Ryan's quiet apartment, had me seeking the peace of the studio earlier than usual. I was sitting on my mat trying to settle my mind into something resembling calm when I became aware of someone approaching. I looked up to find Ryan standing beside my mat, holding something in his hand. Hey, he said quietly, settling onto the mat next to mine. This was new. We'd been gradually moving closer over the past few weeks, but tonight he'd chosen the spot directly beside me, close enough that I could smell that clean, uncomplicated scent I'd noticed before. Hey yourself. I watched as he pulled off that black hoodie, revealing a gray t-shirt that fit him well enough to suggest he took care of himself outside of yoga class. How was your weekend? Quiet. He was arranging his props with that same methodical precision I'd come to associate with him, but there was something different in his energy tonight, less carefully contained, more present. Yours? Same. Good quiet or bad quiet? He paused in his setup, considered the question seriously. Good, I think. Sometimes quiet is just quiet, you know? Not hiding from anything, not avoiding anything, just existing in the space. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. There was a difference between the silence that came from shutting the world out and the silence that came from finally being comfortable in your own skin. It sounded like Ryan was learning the difference, too. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his mat bag and pulling out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me without explanation, then turned his attention back to his props as if giving me something was the most natural thing in the world. I unfolded the paper carefully, not sure what to expect. What I found made my breath catch. It was a drawing done in black ink with the kind of precise lines that suggested steady hands and careful observation. A figure in a yoga pose. Warrior 3, I realized. The same pose I'd been struggling with when I'd nearly fallen that night in January. But this wasn't just any figure. The proportions, the way the hair fell, the specific angle of the reaching arm, it was me. Me, but seen through someone else's eyes, someone who had been paying attention to more than just my struggle with balance. The figure in the drawing looked strong, focused, graceful in a way I'd never thought to see myself. There was something beautiful about it, something that made me feel seen in a way that was both unsettling and deeply moving. "Ryan," I said, but he was looking straight ahead as Sarah entered the room preparing to begin class. "Later," he said quietly, and there was something almost shy in his voice, like he'd revealed more than he'd intended to and needed time to rebuild his careful walls. I folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into my mat bag, but I could feel its presence there throughout the entire class. Could feel the weight of what it meant, that he'd been watching me closely enough to capture not just my physical form, but something essential about the way I moved through the world, that he'd taken the time to translate that observation into something tangible, something he could give back to me. Class that night felt different, more connected, more intentional. We moved through the sequences side by side, and I found myself matching my breathing to his, letting the steady rhythm of his inhales and exhales guide my own. When we flowed from pose to pose, there were moments where we seemed to move in perfect synchronization, like we'd been practicing together for years instead of just existing in the same space. During Warrior 2, I glanced over at him and found him looking back at me, not studying, not analyzing, just present with me in the moment. There was something intimate about sharing breath and movement like this, about existing in the same pocket of intentional quiet while surrounded by other people who were lost in their own practice. In Savasana, lying in the darkness with Sarah's voice guiding us through relaxation, I became acutely aware of him beside me. The sound of his breathing, slower now, deeper. The warmth radiating from his body just 2 feet away from mine, the sense that even in stillness, even in silence, we were somehow in conversation. When class ended and the lights came up slowly, I felt that familiar reluctance to return to the regular world, to put away the peace and connection I'd found in the darkness. But tonight there was something else too. Anticipation. I wanted to talk to him about the drawing, wanted to understand what had prompted him to create it, to give it to me. We packed up our mats in comfortable silence, moving with the same synchronized rhythm we'd found during practice. When we were ready to leave, when we'd pulled on our coats and wound scarves around our necks, I finally found the courage to ask, "Do you draw people you barely know?" He paused in the doorway, considering the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "Only the ones who look like they're about to disappear." The words hit me like a physical thing, settled in my chest with the weight of recognition, because that was exactly how I'd been feeling, like I was slowly fading from my own life, becoming translucent, existing but not really being present in any meaningful way. "Is that how I look?" I asked as we stepped out into the cold night. "Sometimes." He pulled on his gloves, his movements deliberate and careful, especially when you think no one's watching. We started walking north together as had become our habit. The streets were quiet, most people sensible enough to be inside on a night this cold, and our footsteps echoed off the empty sidewalks. "I don't feel like I'm disappearing," I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true. "No?" He glanced at me, and in the light from the street lamps, his eyes looked darker, more serious. "When's the last time you did something because you wanted to, not because you thought you should?" It was a harder question than it seemed. I tried to think of something recent, something that had come from genuine desire rather than obligation or routine or the kind of autopilot living I'd fallen into over the years. "Yoga," I said finally. "I started yoga because I wanted to." "Good start." There was something almost like approval in his voice. "What else?" I was quiet for several blocks, really thinking about it. Most of my life seemed to be made up of shoulds. I should go to work, I should pay my bills, I should call my sister on Sundays, I should eat better, should exercise more, should be more social, should want the things that other people wanted. But what did I actually want? I don't know, I admitted. I think I've been on autopilot for so long I forgot there were other options. I get that. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the wind. It's easier sometimes. Autopilot. Less risky. Is that why you draw? To remember what you want? He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer, but then he said, I draw to remember what I see. Sometimes when you're not really living in your own life, you forget that other people see you, that you exist in other people's worlds, not just your own. There was something profound in that observation, something that made me think about all the ways we become invisible to ourselves while remaining perfectly visible to everyone else. About how isolation can make you forget that you have an impact, that your presence matters to someone. Do I exist in your world? I asked, then immediately felt foolish for such a direct question. But he didn't seem put off by it. Instead, he stopped walking, turned to face me under a streetlight that cast everything in yellow and shadow. Yeah, he said simply. You do. The honesty of it, the straightforward way he said it, made my chest tight with something I couldn't name. Not attraction exactly, though there was heat there. More like recognition, like he was confirming something I'd been hoping for but hadn't dared to ask about. Good, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. We walked the rest of the way to my building in comfortable silence, but it felt different now, charged with the things we'd said and the things we hadn't said. When we reached my door, when it was time to say goodbye, neither of us seemed ready for the evening to end. Coffee sometime? I asked, the words coming out before I'd really thought them through. I mean, if you want, no pressure. I'd like that, he said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice, like he'd been hoping I'd ask. Tomorrow, there's a place on Clark that stays open late. Tomorrow's good. I gave him the address, watched him add it to his phone, felt that familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with anxiety. This felt like a step forward, like we were moving from the careful distance we'd maintained in class towards something more intentional, more real. David, he said as I was digging for my keys. When I looked back at him, he was studying my face with that same intensity he'd brought to the drawing. I'm glad you exist in my world, too. I went upstairs that night with the drawing tucked carefully in my bag and the memory of his words playing on repeat in my head. In my apartment, I unfolded the paper again, studied the careful lines, the way he'd captured something in me that I'd never seen myself. The figure in the drawing looked strong, centered, present in a way that felt aspirational. I put it on my refrigerator where I'd see it every morning, where it could remind me that someone saw me as more than I saw myself. Wednesday dragged by with the particular sluggishness that comes when you're looking forward to something. I found myself checking the clock obsessively, wondering what Ryan was doing, whether he was thinking about our coffee date too, whether he was having second thoughts about spending time with someone who'd admitted to living on autopilot for years. By the time evening came, I'd changed clothes twice and was fighting the urge to cancel, to text him with some excuse about being tired or busy or any of the lies people tell when they're scared of letting someone see them too clearly. But the drawing on my refrigerator seemed to look at me reproachfully every time I walked past it, reminding me that disappearing was exactly what I'd been doing, and maybe it was time to try something different. The cafe on Clark was one of those places that tried to be everything to everyone: coffee shop, wine bar, bookstore, and art gallery all rolled into one. It was usually too crowded, too loud, too trying hard for my taste. But tonight it felt perfect, bustling enough that our conversation wouldn't feel too exposed, quiet enough that we could actually hear each other. I got there first, claimed a small table near the back, ordered coffee I didn't really want just to have something to do with my hands. When Ryan walked in, scanning the room until he spotted me, I felt that now familiar flutter of nervous excitement. He looked different outside the context of yoga class, more solid somehow, more present in the regular world. He was wearing jeans and a dark blue sweater, his hair slightly messed from the wind, And when he smiled at me across the crowded cafe, I felt something shift in my chest. "Hey," he said, settling into the chair across from me, shrugging out of his coat. "Sorry I'm late. Train was delayed." "You're not late. I was early." I gestured toward my coffee cup. "Nervous energy." "Nervous?" He raised an eyebrow, signaling the waitress for his own coffee. "About coffee?" "About—" I gestured vaguely between us. "This, whatever this is." He considered that seriously the way he considered everything. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know. That's what makes me nervous." The waitress brought his coffee, and he wrapped his hands around the mug in the same way he'd done with the tea in his apartment. There was something grounding about the gesture, something that made me feel less exposed, less like I was revealing too much too soon. "I'm not good at this," he said after a moment. "The getting to know someone thing. I haven't done it in a while." "How long is a while?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring down into his coffee. When he looked up at me, there was something vulnerable in his expression, something that suggested he was about to tell me more than he'd intended to. "There was someone," he said finally. "We used to come to the studio together, Sarah's class. Same mats, same spots, same routine, twice a week for almost 2 years." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not quite jealousy, but something adjacent to it. The thought of Ryan sharing that space, that careful intimacy of synchronized breathing and movement with someone else made me realize how much I'd come to value it as something that belonged to us. "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He stopped coming. I kept going. Ryan's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the weight behind the words. "I think that says everything." "Does it? Say everything, I mean." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tight. Pain, yes, but also a kind of resignation, like he'd accepted something difficult and was still learning how to live with the weight of it. "He wanted things I couldn't give him," Ryan said quietly, "and I wanted things he couldn't understand. We spent 2 years trying to make it work, trying to be what the other person needed, and all we did was make each other miserable." "What kind of things?" I asked, then immediately regretted the question. "Sorry, that's too personal. You don't have to—" "Presence," he said, cutting off my apology. He wanted me to be present, to be here, in my own life, in our relationship, in the world. And I wanted— He paused, considering his words carefully. "I wanted permission to not be okay, to take time to figure out how to exist in my own skin again without having to pretend I was further along in the process than I actually was." The honesty of it took my breath away. It was more than he'd shared in all our previous conversations combined, and it felt like he was trusting me with something precious and fragile. "Are you?" I asked. "Further along now?" "Some days." He took a sip of his coffee, and I noticed his hands weren't quite steady. "Some days I feel like I'm getting the hang of it. Other days I feel like I'm still figuring out how to breathe." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. There was something about the way he talked about existing in his own skin that resonated with my own experience of feeling disconnected from my life, of going through the motions without really being present for any of it. "What about you?" he asked. "The relationship you mentioned, the one that ended when you stopped pretending." I considered how to answer that, how much truth I was ready to share with someone I was just beginning to know. But something about the way he'd opened himself up, the careful vulnerability he'd offered, made me want to match it. "His name was Michael. We were together for 4 years, lived together for 3. On paper, we were perfect. Same education level, same career trajectory, same circle of friends. But I spent the entire relationship trying to be the person he wanted me to be instead of figuring out who I actually was." "What was the difference?" "He wanted someone outgoing, social, ambitious in all the conventional ways. Someone who wanted the house in the suburbs and the two-car garage and the annual vacation to Europe. Someone who knew how to make small talk at dinner parties and looked forward to hosting book clubs and game nights." "And you wanted?" I laughed, but it came out hollow. I had no idea what I wanted. That was the problem. I'd been performing normal for so long I'd forgotten there might be other options. "Is that why you seemed like you were disappearing?" Because you'd been pretending to be someone else for so long you forgot how to be yourself? The observation was so accurate it made me flinch. Maybe, probably. When we broke up, when I finally admitted that I'd been pretending, it felt like relief, but also terror. Because if I wasn't the person I'd been pretending to be, then who was I? And have you figured it out? Who you are? I'm working on it. Yoga helps. The breathing, the focus on being present in your body, it's like practice for being present in your life. Ryan nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. That's why I kept going to class after he stopped. It was the only place where I felt like I could just exist without having to perform or explain or justify anything. Until I started going and disrupted your peace, I said, trying to make it light. But there was a real question underneath it. No. His voice was firm, certain. You didn't disrupt anything. You added something. Made the space feel less like hiding and more like existing. The words settled between us, heavy with meaning. Around us, the cafe continued its evening bustle. Conversations and laughter, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of dishes being cleared. But our table felt insulated from all of that, like we were existing in our own pocket of careful honesty. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yeah?" "The drawing. Why did you draw me?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because you looked like you were trying to disappear, but you were also trying so hard to stay present, to not give up. There was something beautiful about that contradiction, like watching someone fight for something they weren't sure they deserved. Do I deserve it? Whatever I'm fighting for? Everyone deserves to exist in their own life," he said simply. "The hard part is figuring out what that looks like." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us processing the weight of what we'd shared. There was something different about this conversation, something that felt more real than the careful small talk we'd been maintaining for months. Like we'd moved past the surface politeness of strangers and into something that required more courage, more honesty. "What does it look like for you?" I asked eventually. "Existing in your own life?" "I'm still figuring that out." He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug again, and I was starting to recognize it as a grounding gesture, something he did when he needed to anchor himself. "But I think it starts with being present for the small things. The way coffee tastes when you're actually paying attention. The feeling of your breath moving in and out of your body. The way it feels to walk beside someone without having to fill the silence with noise." "You mean like our walks after class?" "Yeah, like that." Something in the way he said it made me look at him more closely. There was something softer in his expression, something that suggested our walks meant more to him than just casual companionship. "I like walking with you," I said, and the admission felt braver than it should have. "Yeah? Yeah. You move through the world like you're paying attention to things, like you're actually present instead of just going through the motions. It makes me want to pay attention too." "Good," he said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice. "Because I was hoping you'd want to keep doing it, the walking, and this," he gestured between us, "whatever this is. I do want to keep doing it." I hesitated, then decided to be brave. "All of it. I want to keep learning how to exist in my own life, and I want to do it with someone who understands what that means. Even though we're both still figuring it out? Especially because we're both still figuring it out." He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him since that snowy afternoon by the lake, and it transformed his entire face, made him look lighter, more hopeful, like some of that careful weight he carried had shifted into something more manageable. "Okay," he said, "let's figure it out together." We stayed at the cafe until they started stacking chairs on tables, until the barista began giving us pointed looks and we realized we were the last customers left. The conversation had meandered through safer topics after our initial honesty, books we'd read, places we'd traveled, the small details that fill in the spaces between strangers becoming something more. When we finally left, stepping out into the cold February night, there was a moment of awkwardness as we stood on the sidewalk, both of us reluctant to end the evening but not sure how to extend it. "This was good," Ryan said, pulling on his gloves. "Thank you for asking for all of it. Thank you for saying yes, and for being honest about the complicated stuff. It felt good to talk about it. I haven't done that in a while. We should do it again, I said, then felt heat creep up my neck at my own boldness. I mean, if you want to, no pressure. I want to, he said, and there was something almost shy in his voice. Maybe dinner next time, somewhere we can hear each other without having to compete with espresso machines. I'd like that. We exchanged goodbyes, headed in our separate directions, but I could feel the evening settling into my bones as I walked home. Something had shifted between us, some barrier had come down, and the possibility of whatever we were building felt both thrilling and terrifying. That night, I looked at the drawing on my refrigerator with new eyes, not just as evidence that someone had been watching me, but as a reminder that someone had seen something worth preserving, worth sharing. Someone had looked at me in my struggle to stay present, to not disappear, and found something beautiful there. For the first time in months, I fell asleep without the anxiety that usually accompanied the end of a day. Instead, there was anticipation, curiosity about what came next, hope that maybe I was finally learning how to exist in my own life in a way that felt authentic and sustainable. And maybe, just maybe, I was learning how to do it alongside someone who understood the particular courage it took to keep showing up, to keep trying, to keep fighting for the right to take up space in the world. The next few weeks fell into a new rhythm, Tuesday and Thursday yoga classes, where we practiced side by side with a synchronicity that felt both natural and intentional. Coffee or dinner afterward, conversations that gradually became more personal, more revealing, as we learned to trust each other with the complicated truths of our respective attempts to figure out how to live authentically. I learned that Ryan had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, that he'd come home to a country that felt foreign after years of hypervigilance and adrenaline, that he'd struggled with the transition back to civilian life, had lost himself for a while in ways he was still reluctant to discuss in detail, that yoga had been part of his recovery, a way to reconnect with his body after years of treating it like a weapon or a tool rather than something that deserved care and attention. He learned that my careful distance from my own life had roots in childhood, in growing up with parents who valued achievement over authenticity, who had shaped me into someone who excelled at meeting other people's expectations while losing track of his own desires. That my relationship with Michael had been both symptom and cause of that disconnection, a 4-year exercise in performing normalcy while my actual self atrophied from neglect. We learned that we both carried guilt about the relationships we'd left behind, him for not being able to be present in the way his ex-boyfriend had needed, me for wasting years of Michael's life while pretending to be someone I wasn't. We learned that we both struggled with the question of what we deserved, whether people like us, people who had spent years disconnected from their own lives, had the right to ask for connection, understanding, love. But slowly, carefully, we also learned that maybe the answer to that question was yes. It was during a Thursday night class in mid-March that I realized something fundamental had shifted between us. We were moving through a flowing sequence, sun salutations that had become as natural as breathing, and I noticed that we weren't just practicing side by side anymore, we were practicing together. Moving in perfect synchronization, breathing as one entity, existing in the kind of wordless communication that usually took years to develop. During Warrior 2, I glanced over at him and found him looking back at me, not checking my form or comparing our poses, but simply being present with me in the moment. There was something intimate about it, about sharing breath and movement and intentional silence while surrounded by other people who were lost in their own practice. In that moment, I understood what Sarah had meant all those months ago when she talked about connections and energy. This wasn't just 2 people who happened to practice yoga in the same room. This was partnership, synchronicity, the kind of deep attunement that happens when 2 people learn to exist in the same space without trying to change or fix or improve each other. After class, as we packed up our mats, Sarah approached us with that knowing smile she got when she'd been watching something develop over time. "You 2 have beautiful energy together," she said quietly. "Very grounded, very present. It's lovely to see." I felt heat creep up my neck, but Ryan just nodded, accepting the observation without embarrassment. "Thank you," he said simply, "for creating a space where that's possible." Sarah squeezed his shoulder, then mine, and headed toward her office to close up for the night. Ryan and I finished packing in comfortable silence, the weight of her words settling between us like a blessing. Outside, the March air held the first real promise of spring, still cold but with an underlying softness that suggested winter's grip was finally loosening. We stood on the sidewalk, both of us reluctant to say goodbye, both of us aware that something had shifted during class. "Dinner?" Ryan asked, then added quickly, "If you're not too tired. We could just walk if you prefer." "Dinner sounds good." We ended up at a small Italian place a few blocks from the studio, the kind of neighborhood restaurant that prioritized good food over atmosphere, where the lighting was warm and the tables were close enough together that conversation felt intimate without being overheard. "Can I tell you something?" Ryan asked after we'd ordered. After the wine had arrived and we'd settled into the comfortable quiet that had become characteristic of our evenings together. "Always. I've been thinking about what Sarah said, about our energy together." "Yeah?" "I've been in relationships before where I felt like I had to perform, like I had to be a certain version of myself to be acceptable. But with you," he paused, considering his words carefully, "with you, I feel like I can just be present. Like you're not waiting for me to be different or better or further along in whatever process I'm supposed to be working through." The honesty of it made my chest tight with something that might have been gratitude or relief or recognition. I feel the same way. Like I can stop trying to figure out who I'm supposed to be and just exist as whoever I am right now. "And who are you right now?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months, ever since the night I'd finally admitted to Michael that I'd been pretending to be someone else for the duration of our relationship. But sitting across from Ryan in the warm light of the restaurant, I realized I might finally have an answer. "I'm someone who's learning how to be present in his own life," I said. "Someone who's figuring out what it means to want things, instead of just accepting what other people think I should want. Someone who's discovering that maybe authenticity isn't something you achieve once and then have forever. Maybe it's something you practice day by day, breath by breath." "And what do you want? Right now, in this yair?"